about Gaddafi now, though.
Yeah, they say, you know, they say the same thing about Gaddafi. Gaddafi didn't have nuclear weapons, he gave them up, and so he was attacked. I don't think it holds, but anyway, they do repeat it, so they seem to believe it. The second question is a little bit easier to answer. China's not ambivalent about North Korea having nuclear weapons, and they don't think that it would be good for North Korea to have nuclear weapons because it gives America a problem, because it also presents problems for China. It's just that on their priority of desires, North Korea not having a nuclear weapon doesn't rank very high. I think this is just a matter of priorities. It's not as high a priority as having a buffer state and having their own secure borders.
Okay. Thanks, Mark, for your interesting presentation. I've been speaking to a lot of my staff colleagues on the Hill recently about North Korea, my former colleagues, and I can say engagement's not a priority. They're all watching they told me after watching the YouTube video from Malaysia airport security of the woman throwing the poison in Kim Jong-nam's face, and I mean, it's not a question of demonization. It's sort of like the York King Richard III killing his little uncles and burying them in the Tower of London. Shakespeare didn't have a hard time making a case against Richard III. But the question more is about, it seems to be sanctions, 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 as you mentioned. But the way I hear they might be going now is talking about sanctioning Chinese business entities in Dandong and other areas in northeast China that do business with North Korea. I know Chairman Royce personally believes BDA, Banco Delta Asia, which was a Macau entity, but in 2005, Portugal given Macau back, so it was a Chinese entity. He felt that was very effective, and Chris Hill stopped it before it could be proven. But I've asked them in return, my colleagues, I said, well, there's a contradiction here. If President Trump and Tillerson, they're calling the Chinese and saying, we need your cooperation to solve the North Korea problem. And we know from Chinese history, and I'm reading Kissinger's book on China, he said one way not to get the Chinese to cooperate is to appear to be bullying them, like the British did in Hong Kong and the West used to bully them. So sanctions seems to be the way, but my question is, how do you solve the contradiction if the next step in sanctions that the House, at least staff are looking at, is to sanction Chinese businesses that do business with North Korea? And yet, the other argument from the Trump administration is that we need to engage China to solve North Korea. How do you solve the contradiction?
I think there's a way to solve the contradiction, and we saw it in last year when the United States put sanctions on the Chinese company. It was called the Dandong Xiaojin something company, right? They talked to the Chinese first of all. They consulted and said, we're going to do this, and why don't you do it too? And the Chinese did. They imposed their own sanctions, criminal charges against the company. So it was a pretty good case of Chinese-American cooperation. So that's the answer, I think, is you work with China instead of, as you say, bullying them, and you put the sanctions on, but you have engagement as part of the strategy, not the first part of the strategy, so you have to tell the Chinese, yeah, we're doing it.
The only problem with that, I don't see members of Congress going and consulting with China first before they draft legislation, right?
No, but implementing the legislation, the executive branch can have a chance to talk to the Chinese first, and we're going to have a pretty good ambassador there. So I hope that we do that.
I want to talk another question about negotiations. Whenever Americans meet with North Korean officials, and we've had some track 2 meetings, Joe Witt and other people have been involved. Bob Carlin has been involved in these meetings. Jimmy Carter, went there 2 or 3 times over the last 7 or 8 years. Whenever the North Koreans meet with the Americans, they give high priority to the peace treaty issue. And they say to the Americans, if you want any progress on the nuclear or missile issues, you have to be willing to negotiate with us a peace treaty to end the Korean War. They really do lay that on the table. When Steve Bosworth went there, they really hit him with that back in, I think, 2010, the peace treaty demand. Now, among some of these Americans who recently have been talking to the North Koreans, they have begun to advocate that we consider going into that kind of negotiation with North Korea. I've seen several ideas that we really need to just not reject this. We need to consider maybe going into this kind of negotiation with them. These Americans seem to rule out the 6-party talks now. And they seem to favor this kind of bilateral negotiation. So I have 2 questions for you about the peace treaty issue. Number 1, would it be acceptable at all to accept a peace treaty negotiation that is bilateral without South Korea? Would that be acceptable at all? And secondly, in the broad framework of the nuclear and missile issues, could a peace treaty negotiation provide any sort of promising or viable framework for our side, and here I would include the South Koreans, to negotiate with the North on these issues? Would this be a better framework than returning to 6-party talks at this point?
That's a good set of questions. A year ago, I was supposed to be one of those Americans engaging with North Koreans in a Track 2 exercise. It was the weekend of the Washington Snowzilla. It was everything was closed down, so I didn't get out of town. I missed the chance. I was supposed to be the guy who was going to talk tough to the North Koreans, which you might think I wouldn't be able to do very well given my presentation, but anyway, I was ready to do that. And that was going to be in Kuala Lumpur. I don't think we're going to be having those talks in Kuala Lumpur anymore. But I'm very familiar with the discussions, and I have, in London, I talk with North Koreans a lot. Tae Yong-ho was a frequent interlocutor. I know him very well. And yeah, the peace treaty discussions we should never have negotiations bilaterally, United States and North Korea, over a peace treaty involving the Korean Peninsula that doesn't involve the majority of the Koreans. So only in circumstances when and if the South Korean government were to ask the United States on their behalf to negotiate. And I can't see them ever doing that. But if they ever did, well, then it'd be okay. If they didn't, then it's not okay. We shouldn't exclude the South Koreans. I just can't see it. It doesn't have to be 6-party talks. It could be 3-party, 4-party, 8-party, 10-party. As long as the South Koreans are involved or give us their chip. Now, I don't think a peace treaty in and of itself is what North Koreans want. If it's just a peace treaty, we'll give them a piece of paper, peace treaty. But what they want, of course, is U.S. troops out of South Korea, which doesn't, you can have a peace treaty and still you have U.S. troops there if the South Koreans want them. And so I'm not opposed to having peace treaty talks, but I certainly wouldn't want the United States to negotiate an end to the alliance and to forces without the South Koreans agreeing to that. Can a peace treaty negotiation provide a viable framework for discussions on the nuclear matter? That's kind of the theory. You have one track doing peace treaty, one track doing the denuclearization. The danger is that the denuclearization talks would go nowhere, the peace treaty would end up so you have to have it connected so that, in the end, you wouldn't finalize anything unless you got both of them. I think there's a possibility because, after all, if the peace treaty is what North Korea really wants, then it's leverage to get what we really want, which is denuclearization. But again, I wouldn't say it's as a alternative to the six-party talks. I think the process is not the issue; it's what's the substance.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Time is up. Okay.